This hadith today, inshallah, is it's actually one that's very, very near and dear to my heart. It's one that I enjoy a lot. I think it's one we can benefit a lot in these times. So without further ado, عن أبي هريرة رضي الله تعالى عنه قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن الله تعالى طيب لا يقول إلا الطيبة وإن الله أمر المؤمنين بما أمر به المرسلين فقال تعالى يا أيها الرسل كلوا من الطيبات وعملوا صالحا وقال تعالى يا أيها الذين آمنوا كلوا من الطيبات ما رزقناكم ثم ذكر الرجل يطير السفر أشعث أغبر يمد يديه إلى السماء يا رب يا رب ومطعمه حرام ومشربه حرام وملبسه حرام وغذي بالحرام فأنى يستجاب له رواه مسلم. It's a very powerful hadith narrated by Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, the Sahabi we went over last week. He narrates that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Verily, Allah the Exalted is pure. He does not accept that which is pure. Allah commands the believers with what He commanded the messengers. Allah the Almighty has said in the Quran, O you messengers, eat of the good things and act righteously, or the pure things and act righteously. And Allah the Almighty also said, O you who believe, eat of the pure things that we have provided you with." Then the Prophet mentioned the case of the man who, having journeyed far, is disheveled and dusty, and stretches out his hands to the sky, asking his Lord in desperation, O Lord, while his food is unlawful, his drink is unlawful, his clothing is unlawful, and he is nourished with things that are unlawful. So how can he be answered? Narrated by Imam Muslim. So this is a very, very powerful hadith with a lot of implications, a lot of discussion, especially in our times. I usually go over the Sahabi at the very beginning, but Abu Hurairah is the Sahabi we went over last week, so we'll just be going straight to the hadith, inshallah, this week. So Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells us that Allah will only accept what is tayyib. And He says that He is Himself tayyib and only accepts what is tayyib. So it's very important to understand what tayyib is. So what is this word tayyib? Imam Nawawi, the one who compiled these hadith, this collection, he wrote a commentary on Sahih Muslim, which is where this hadith is found. And he says that tayyib is, when it's attributed to God, when it's attributed to Allah, it's the lack of deficiencies or imperfections. And it's rooted in purity, cleanliness, and awareness. It's related to the name of Allah, al-Qudus, which is the sacred or the pure. And the word itself can be defined, the best way sometimes to define a word is by understanding its opposite. So the opposite of tayyib in Arabic is khabith. So what is khabith? Now we have two words we got to define. So khabith is that which is impure, adulterated, dirty. And so tayyib is everything opposite of that. So when it comes to Allah, He's free from imperfections, impurity, falsehood. There's a hadith that says that Allah is tayyib, He's pure, and He loves purity. And He is clean and He loves cleanliness, and He's generous and He loves generosity. So these two hadith, they really indicate this thing, what we call in Arabic tajanus. It's a concept called tajanus, which is to love in someone else that which you have yourself. So the example is like if you're looking for a friend, for a spouse, you're oftentimes looking for people who match in values. And so you're not looking for someone who matches you perfectly. You're looking for these core values to be the same between the two, that are going to have love between one another. And so this is what Allah's meaning in this hadith, is looking for someone who has that purity. It's an attribute that's very important to Allah. And that kind of brings the discussion of what are these names and attributes of Allah. There's two broad categories of attributes of Allah. So there's 99 names that we know of that are attributes and names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and each one brings to us a different attribute dimension of God. There's two broad categories. Some of them are attributes that we should actually be practicing to instill in our own lives, and we should always be working towards trying to perfect and get closer to God through them. And there's other ones that are unique to God and that we could never emulate, we should never try to emulate. So the example is, here we have the example of tayyib. We should try to be pure in our own lives, just as God is pure. We should try to be merciful, just as God is merciful. We should try to be loving. We should try to be clean. Things that we could not try to emulate are things like pride. God is rightfully prideful, not in like a way that we would describe someone as like being prideful and arrogant as a bad thing. God is rightfully prideful because He has everything. He's the master of everything. He's the Razak. He's the one who sustains everything. He's the provider. No one could be the provider except for the one provider. So these are things that we cannot be, and if someone was to claim them, it's like offensive. There's actually a hadith that says that, where Allah, there's a hadith Qudsi, where Allah is talking, and Allah says that greatness is his lower garment and pride is his upper garment. And whoever attempts to snatch away one of these will be crushed and he won't mind. And so this is just showing us that there's a distinction between some attributes we should try to emulate and not. So okay, now we have concept of tayyib, and that God is tayyib and he's seeking tayyib. So how do we try to achieve this level? Well, we're commanded here, it's very interesting to note that he says that we're commanded with what the messengers have been commanded with. So the messengers are obviously held to the highest standard. And it's very interesting because here it's kind of a lesson in the Quran when it speaks like, oh you messengers, for example, or ayyuha alladhina amanu, oh you who believe. When it's saying these kind of statements, it's trying to get your attention to focus on these are attributes of messengers, for example, and we should try to work towards that. When it says ayyuha alladhina amanu, it's speaking to you directly. There's a Sahabi named Ibn Mas'ud who says that every time he heard in the Quran, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, he would bolt up as if someone had called his name. Because really there's no difference between saying that and calling you by name, like Ya Kareem, or Ya Layth. Like it's saying exactly like it's calling you specifically. And so those verses, when they come to us, we should really like kind of perk up as if God's talking to us directly. And so, and another thing we learn from this is also that when there are commandments given to the Prophet, they're applicable to all Muslims, unless there's an exception made. So there's a few times in the Quran where Allah commands something for the Prophet that's unique to him, and it'll mention that it's unique to him. Or the Prophet he himself will clarify that it's unique to him. But otherwise, generally speaking, they are applicable to all Muslims. So going back to the concept of tayyib, this concept of purity, it's more than purity. There's a lot more depth to it. There's a lot of shades. In the Quran, this word comes up a lot. Tayyib comes up a lot in different contexts, and it has a lot of different shades. So depending on how it comes, it'll have a different meaning. So when it regards to food, the minimum. So when it says like food is tayyib, the minimum is that it's halal, and there's a lot more depth to this. And we'll come back to this concept of food and tayyib. It also mentions like the earth, like the ground being tayyib, which means like the ability to grow food. So arable land. There's like the wind could be tayyib, which is something that's a wind that's not destructive, it's enjoyable, it's not displeasant. A person could be tayyib, which means that they're pure, they have no illicit relationships. There's a kalimat tayyib, which is the word, right, or a statement that is pure, and that's something that doesn't have anything undesirable in it. And then there's al-kalima, which is the statement that is pure, and that means the shahada, la ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah, that there's no God but Allah and that Muhammad is his messenger. So that is the purest of statements. But coming back to this concept of food and consumption, this hadith is really kind of talking about that, like what you consume being pure. And in that there's two main levels. There's the minimum, which is that it's halal. So halal is something that is permissible. The opposite of it is haram, which is impermissible. So what we consume should not be haram, it should not be impermissible. It should be something that is, at least the minimum is halal. But halal is very much a legal term, and we'll get into this. There's also a deeper shade to this. There is the concept of like cleanliness, purity, and the ethics, and that's something we're going to really focus on. It's like the ethics of how something comes about. And so Allah allows us, basically everything is halal, except for the few things that are mentioned to be haram. And these are kind of setting minimum guidelines. Halal is something that you ask a scholar about an opinion for, and they'll tell you what is halal or what's haram, what you should do or what you should not do. But tayyib is not something you're going to always go and ask someone else for. It's something that really resides in the heart. There's a hadith that says, istafti qalbak, which means seek counsel in your own heart. And this is something we all experience. It's you go to the restaurant or you go to like the grocery store and you know that this meat came from a farmer, like someone tortured it, for example. And you might purchase it, but in doing so you feel something in your heart, and oftentimes we kind of ignore it. But that little feeling in the heart, what it's telling us is that you really need to kind of pause for a second, give it space, listen to it, and seek counsel from it. We shouldn't kind of glance over these little moments in our lives where we feel like something somehow feels wrong. We should really listen to that feeling. And it's also subjective. Tayyib from person to person might change depending on the context, the region. Someone might be allergic to food, so that food wouldn't be like pure for them. That would be something that would be harmful for their body. And tayyib is something that should not be harmful. Or someone might know something, they might have worked in the industry, they know a little more, so they're going to be slightly more aware about what's pure, what's impure. So it's very much case by case and case dependent. So halal, like we mentioned, has a legal meaning, and tayyib is a more spiritual, ethical meaning. And so you can have both, but they can also be separate. Not everything halal is tayyib, and not everything tayyib is just halal. You can imagine like a 2x2 table. So you can have tayyib and halal, or you can have khabith and halal, or you can have tayyib and haram and khabith and haram. And so an example is, for example, like you can imagine, a pig that is raised organically, no hormones added. It's massaged every day and washed every day and given like clean, free range, whatever food. That pig would be like, have the qualities of tayyib. Of course, it's haram, so it wouldn't be tayyib. But it would have the qualities of tayyib, but it wouldn't be halal, so you couldn't have it. Then you can imagine a situation, you have a cow. We're allowed to eat cows. But if it was tortured, it was slaughtered improperly, then that would be something that might be, it might be tortured, but it was slaughtered properly. So when it says halal, the bare minimum legal definition for the meat comes at the end, where it's the slaughtering and the intention for which it was slaughtered. So it might be halal, but it's going to be khabith. It's going to have these properties of impurity. And so a lot of times people ask, like, okay, do I go to the restaurant where I know the food's like certified halal, but the animals weren't treated right, or should I go to the organic, free range, whatever market, but I know it's not halal, it's like wasn't slaughtered properly? And the answer really is you should avoid both. You should try to find something that is halal and tayyib. That is the best effort to make, because halal is very much a minimum legal definition. And a good example of this is, imagine you're walking in the road, the law says you do not litter. So imagine if you're walking in the road and you see a bunch of litter around you, you have no legal obligation to pick up that litter. You can keep walking as long as you're not adding to it. But the higher path is always, obviously, you see something, you pick it up and you throw it away. So you can't always go to the minimum legal definition as the way for life. And the reason for this is really, Islam's not trying to make things overly difficult, overly complicated. Imagine everything in your life, you have to not just find out how the end product was, but you also have to find out every step in the chain, the entire supply chain. You have to do research and you have to analyze everything. If everything in our lives was like that for every single person, not everyone has that kind of access, and it will be too difficult for people. So it's not trying to make things practical, but making bare minimum legal distinctions, and then each of us, according to our ability, should try to go beyond that. And that's this concept of tayyib. And it applies to all aspects of our life. Rizq, like, your sustenance, your finance, food and drink, housing, education, your job, marriage, friendships, clothing, jewelry, tech, entertainment, worship, charity, taxes, intentions. All these things are things that you can achieve this level of increased purity, and you can make steps towards it. And our society, I think, is largely founded on a lot of things that are khabith, that's impure, and a lot of that's because there's not really this like ethics that's driving the decision making in terms of supply chains, in terms of sourcing, in terms of sustainability, in terms of all these things. It's not ethics that's driving these. It's a profit motive, and we have a very different profit motive, but ours ends with the ET, not IT. So you really have to, I think, soften your heart. That's a big answer to this, is you really have to soften your heart and give it that time to listen to it and pay attention to it. There's a hadith that says that if a person is to give sadaqah, but that sadaqah is coming from khabith, which is impure, it won't be accepted. And there's an ayah that says in the Quran, it says, "O you who believe, give in charity that which we have provided you in purity. Do not give from the impure." If you were to be given something like that was impure like that, it would make you angry and you would detest it. So why would you give it to Allah? And the end of the ayah ends with, Allah is the all-wealthy, the praiseworthy. And in another verse, Allah tells us, He reminds us that Allah does not need your wealth. He doesn't need your wealth or your food. Rather, He wants to test you. He wants to see which of you, He wants to train you in your taqwa. Taqwa is God consciousness. Taqwa is this awareness of God in each moment of your life. And so really it's a test for us, and it's a way to train us. That's what zakat is, for example, giving in charity, giving sadaqah, helping people around. All these things that we're asked to give in Islam, it's not because God is in need for us. It's a way to test us. And at the end of the day, everything we give is really for our own benefit in the hereafter. And so it's a way for us to purify our wealth, giving in charity. It's a way for us to purify our wealth, and it comes back to us in the end. So we shouldn't be giving even in charity from impure means. So that person who's like, I'm gonna gamble, and if I win, I'm just gonna give it to a masjid. It's like, dude, relax. Like, that's not the way to do it. Learning. So this applies also to like learning when you're getting your education, when you're traveling, when you're doing Hajj. You should try to source things in your halal rizq. halal means. Otherwise, it's going to take on the properties of its source. So if you fund your Hajj trip, for example, from a haram job or something, not kind of calling one out, or from a haram job, then that's going to impact the quality of that Hajj. And it applies to everything. So interest is obviously a big source of difficulty for all of us living here. Interest could add a source of impurity, the work, the kind of work that you do. And of course, all these things, there's limits to them. There's a certain amount that you can do. So there's certain circumstances where, if all else fails and you have no other choice, then you're doing it out of necessity. But a lot of times we convince ourselves that this is necessary and that there's no other way. It's really just trying to get something. There's no reason you should take out a loan to get a Mercedes, for example. That is not necessity. That is pure just want. But we sometimes justify ourselves, I need a Mercedes, I need a house here. There are some level of sacrifices expected. But circumstances arrive in a lot of people's lives where exceptions are made. So I'm not trying to make things too difficult here, but don't make it too easy on yourselves. Allah says that the pure, tayyib, and the impure, khabith, they're not equal. Even if the impure and its accumulation may impress you. This is an ayah of the Quran, Surah Ma'idah, verse 100. And so, be walking around, you see someone's Tesla, their nice cars, the TV shows, their diet, bodies, their wealth, their houses, all these things impress us when we see them around, how these people are so wealthy and have a private island and all these things. Allah's telling us not to be impressed with this stuff. It's not impressive that they accumulate all these things through illicit, unethical, dirty means. Rather, you should really be impressed with the things that come from a pure source, even if it's a little bit. And that should really be our motive at the end of it. I think a beautiful example of this, just almost to sidetrack a little bit, is food. Classically, humans spent about a third of their time and their wealth and resources on food and getting food and preparing food. And now we spend less than 10%, here in America at least, we spend less than 10%, I think it's 7-8% of our food on average, wealth on average, on food. So a lot of our resources are going to other parts of our life, and we're cutting corners when it comes to food. And it's not because food costs less, it's just because we're cutting corners. Now we have high fructose corn syrup and everything, and now we have all these hormones and antibiotics added to all our foods that are cutting corners. And workers that are preparing foods are not paid enough, and they're taking advantage of immigrants. So all these things are happening that cause our food prices to drop, but it's not ethical. So that's why a lot of times, not everyone has access to this. It's definitely a place of privilege. I know as students, it's not something we can probably do yet, but we should always try to strive to have, better level, better quality, better sourced foods, even if it's going to cost more, because that increase in cost is actually how much it realistically should cost, and everything else is cheaper just because it's cutting corners. And that's probably a better way to think about it. And we should also try to sacrifice a little bit, some modesty in our possessions, hunger and stuff. That's not that bad. It's going to be a lot better reward than trying to source things from what's khabith. Another hadith says that Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas one day stood up and asked the Prophet ﷺ to make dua for him, for all of his du'as to be accepted immediately. So imagine someone comes up to you, he's like, how do I get my dua accepted, all of them immediately? What would you say to that person? You tell them maybe go pray 10,000 rak'ahs, go read the Quran upside down 8 times. You tell them to do something crazy. But the Prophet ﷺ just told them, which means perfect or purify what you eat. And this is one example of so many in the hadith and in the Quran that connects spirituality to our consumption in our bodies. Maybe more shock value stuff. Prophet ﷺ also mentioned, he said, he swore by he whose hands his soul is in, that the servant of Allah that puts a morsel of impure food in his mouth that reaches his stomach, Allah will not accept his prayer for 40 days. Very serious. Another hadith mentions that whoever spends his life nourishing his body with impurity, hell is more deserving for him, because Jannah is a place of purity. And there's another hadith that mentions that whoever purchases a piece of clothing for 10 dirhams, which is a currency, so for 10 dirhams, 1 dirham of it was from an impure source, then any prayer in that garment would not be accepted. And so this is kind of showing us this is very, Allah takes this stuff very seriously. And you can see the long-term implications of it too. It's not just about your personal decision making, because when you vote and when with your wallet and you buy something that's impure, you're not just affecting yourself and your body, you're also affecting everything in that chain. You're affecting that migrant worker who is paid has terrible working conditions, is not paid enough. You're supporting these hormones. You're supporting all these different unethical things that are part of this chain. So it's really, that's why it's taken so seriously, because if we cut it from the source, from the purchasing, and you change how production is made by creating demand for it, then you're really changing how society is structured. Society is only structured this way because we allow it to be, and we participate in it. And so this is a big part of it. And so, and this also, I think, shows us just how practical these hadith and these teachings are supposed to be in our lives. These are real issues 1,400 years later. We are dealing with these issues even more than then. You can imagine at that time when someone says like, oh, eat halal tayyib meat. All meat was like organic and free range and all that stuff, so it's just, slaughter it, right? But now it's like, oh my God, there's so many things that we do with meat. You really have to be much more conscious and aware. And a really good example of this is, I'm going to keep talking about meat. So does anyone know what like European cut is? So there's different ways you can slaughter an animal, a cow. In Islam, you're supposed to cut the throat horizontally. Yeah, so you cut the carotid arteries and the jugular vein, and it's instant death. It's very painless. You're supposed to have a very sharp knife. There's another hadith about that, which we'll get into in a few hadith. And it's supposed to be very painless. You can't let an animal see another animal be killed, because that's torture. And so there's all these things. A European cut is basically what they'll do is they have these tracks where cows will walk one by one. They'll see the cow in front of them get slaughtered, which is terrifying. Then they get flipped upside down, this electric, like mechanical chain. Then they get a hollow bullet, and they shoot the brain, so it doesn't die, but they're partially brain dead. And then they take a stab and they stab the heart of the animal. And the reason that they stab the heart, and then they cut upwards like that. So the reason they stab the heart is because they want the heart to stop beating, so that way the blood stays in the meat. And if the blood stays in the meat, it weighs more, which means that they get more profit. But we know obviously like the blood staying in the meat can add a lot of toxins and can add like a lot of room for a lot of different diseases to spread, and so it's totally haram in Islam that people do this stuff. And so that's just one example, obviously. It's kind of gruesome. We're causing the destruction of the world and oppressing others through these things. So it's very, very important. Imam Ghazali, he mentioned in the book so he has Ihya al-Ulumuddin, which is like a series of books on spirituality and insights he had. One of them is from Bab al-Muhlikat, which is that which destroys spirituality. And he says in order to conquer, you need to conquer two desires in order to attain spirituality and self-discipline. And those two desires are the carnal desires and the food. And he mentioned like the organ parts of it, so like conquering your genitals and your stomach. And that will open a lot of doors in terms of discipline and spirituality. And a sound heart can really only be attained in a sound body. And so a lot of the sunnah, we always call people like, oh, do the sunnah. It's very conveniently we skip over the diets of the sunnah and the lifestyle of the sunnah. And there's so much we can learn from there, about portioning, about ethics, about simplicity. There's so much benefit in them, even just like the kinds of food and the times of food and sleep and all. Like there's a lot of health benefits, let alone spiritual benefits to all this. Now, what's the result of all this? I'm going to start wrapping up. What's the result of all this? Like you're working towards this purity, whatever. First of all, it's your body. You got to take care of it, and it's your society. You got to take care of it. And there's alternatives, so we need to start seeking them. Now, when someone who has purified a lot of different aspects of their life, Allah says that angels will come at his death and pray for him, that Allah will welcome them into Jannah, those who are purified, because Jannah is only for those who are purified. It's a big part of it. And their deeds will be accepted from them. And then the rest of the hadith mentions this story, right? That's either from the Prophet ﷺ himself or Abu Hurairah added it. There's two opinions on that. That the man who was desperate and calling to Allah, his dua won't be accepted, even though he's doing everything right. He lifts his hands up to Allah, and like we know, if you lift your hands up and you pray out of desperation, out of desire for Allah, you call for Allah 3 times. That Allah says whoever calls upon him 3 times, Allah's too shy to turn him down, turn him away. But this man is doing all these things, but because of the sourcing of his food and his circumstances and his clothes, Prophet ﷺ is reminding us, like, who's going to accept his dua? And so, obviously, this is exempting, because in our Islam, it's exempting people like who do things accidentally, out of ignorance, out of forgetfulness. You're not held accountable for that. But when we do know something, we should try to act on it. And we shouldn't seek ignorance either. Ignorance is not bliss. We should try to learn more about the world around us and act on it. And overall, just like kind of a conclusion of all this is that Islam is not about abstract morality, and it's not about being secluded, and it's not about ignoring the very real issues that happen all around us. It's about dealing with the society and finding solutions to all of this, and doing your part to change these unethical, impure parts of our world. We really got to start voting with our wallets and our habits. It's about it's happening already. Like we already see people like non-Muslims and Muslims all around the world who are seeking things that are sustainable, organic, and healthy, and alternative means, and really asking questions about the sources of things. So it's happening all around us. We should really be at the forefront of that. We should all help each other here, even on a local level. Creating one great thing I think we could do is start creating like lists of just ethical alternatives. One person finds like a good milk that's at the supermarket that's from a better source, and we start buying that milk, and maybe like a good meat place, and a good place for bread, and a good place for clothing, whatever. So just having these lists of like, where do we find these alternatives if we want them? So may Allah accept from us and protect us from what is harmful and impure, and make us from those who are purified and purifying. Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much.